Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a brief overview of the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Ahnaf, and good evening from Israel. It's been an interesting week, a lot of events taking place overseas. As we know, Prime Minister Netanyahu spent the latter part of last week in Hungary, in Budapest, where he met a very warm welcome by the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. It was a sort of a softball event. Netanyahu wanted to travel abroad, not just to the US, but probably somewhere else in the world, knowing that his hosts would not accede to the ICC warrant. And as expected, the ICC did get in contact with the Hungarian government, asking them to arrest Netanyahu and pass him on. Not only did Viktor Orban and the Hungarian government not accede to that particular request, but in fact, it withdrew from the ICC. This was obviously very carefully choreographed from the beginning. It was a good look for Netanyahu. He came out of it looking well. It could be that other countries will do the same. Netanyahu did say it's the first country to withdraw from the ICC since the arrest warrants were given, but he, in his words, not the last. Controversially, according to some in Israel, Netanyahu then spent the weekend in Hungary for no particular reason. It was clear there was no more meetings. You know, the big meeting with Orban was already, I think, on Wednesday. So there was no real need to stay, but there was a decision made that he would stay until Sunday and then travel back after the Sabbath. Obviously, Israeli prime ministers, unless there's a real need, do not travel on the Sabbath. So it could be that there was a meeting put on Friday, but certainly not one substantial enough to stay away from a country in the time of war and everything else that was going on. But what did happen is during, it's not clear exactly when, but Netanyahu was summoned, let's say, or invited to Washington, D.C. During that trip to Hungary. And he did travel in the end on Sunday straight to the US. Netanyahu was a little bit blindsided by this, not the first or the last time he'll be blindsided in this particular episode. But there was a suspicion that he was being called by President Trump because Israel, I think, were, if not the only country, one of the only countries that, with the threat of the raising of tariffs by the US on countries around the world, Israel decided to remove all its tariffs on US imports to Israel, ahead of that thinking that there would be reciprocal exchange of zero tariffs. And Netanyahu lauded the fact that he was the first leader to visit President Trump, not just once, but twice, and the first one since the tariffs were raised. What he did find out that when he was on his way to Hungary is that the US obviously didn't do the reciprocal 0% tariffs and actually imposed 17% on Israel. But there was a feeling that he was being summoned to DC to negotiate and see if he could lower that somewhere close to zero. There was a feeling within Netanyahu's camp that perhaps he could even show an impressive negotiating skills and come out of it and even show the world this is how you negotiate with Trump. Perhaps that was something that they could coordinate together. Unfortunately, that is not how it worked out. interestingly, the press conference held between the two. At first, we were told there wouldn't be a press. First, we were told there was a press conference, and then we were told it was cancelled. In the end, we got one of those sort of impromptu, sort of informal sit-downs where the president likes to receive questions from the journalists. It is clear that this was not going to be a similar repeated event from the first time that the two of them sat down together after Netanyahu visited DC a number of weeks ago. The atmosphere was different. Bibi was very restrained, barely talking, allowing President Trump really to lead the way and sort of just having warm words whenever the conversation turned to him. What was clear, and Israeli commentators were looking through Netanyahu's body language throughout, is that the Israelis have been blindsided by a number of things. First of all, going back to tariffs, it is clear that Trump had decided not to remove the tariffs on Israel. And when asked, he said, maybe we will, maybe we won't. Netanyahu did not come back with any sort of win or success or achievement on that. There was really no moving, and the tariff continues, even though President Trump, over the last hour or whenever it was, has decided to lower all tariffs, or at least freeze them for 90 days. If I understand correctly, there will still be a 10% lower limit of tariffs during that time. But Netanyahu did not get the win he wanted. He did not get to show the world the special treatment, the special relationship that he has with Donald Trump, and it just got worse. On the issue of Iran, what the Israeli government had been hoping for, and certainly when Netanyahu got the invite to DC, he was hoping that as far as Iran, there would be some sort of timetable. He did understand that the president had been talking about the possibility of extending a hand towards negotiations. Iran had shown no interest, so there was a feeling that the Israelis could start to talk about a definitive timetable where some sort of decision, possibly with military action, could be sort of put in the diary, as it were. What he did get is just before they faced the cameras, there was a 1 hour sit down where some of these issues were brought up for the first time, not least the fact that the Americans would be sitting in direct talks, as the Americans say it. The Iranians still claim that it's going to be indirect talks. This will take place on Saturday. But the Americans and Donald Trump said to the cameras with the Israeli Prime Minister next to him that we will have direct talks with Iran. You could see Netanyahu's face. By that time, he had absorbed it and he understood how to keep as much of a poker face as possible. Certainly, it was a major problem, a major challenge, and certainly not the win on Iran that Netanyahu had been hoping for. The third problematic part that came out from that, as far as Israel and Netanyahu in particular, was the issue of Turkey and its President Erdogan. As we know, Erdogan had been taking far more bellicose stance towards Israel, even recently at the end of Ramadan, calling for the destruction of Israel. Netanyahu was hoping not just to get the American president to restrain his Turkish counterpart, but certainly on the ground, on a practical level, the Turks are very keen on establishing certain military bases in Syria. That is something that Israel cannot tolerate. There were reports that Turkish commanders had been looking for specific bases around the country that they could set up shop, similar to what the Russians had during the Assad regime. And Israel basically got ahead of them and bombed all of these 3 potential airstrips and bases. But it's clear that this has the potential to be something very major. And Netanyahu was hoping to get some sort of assurances from Donald Trump. Well, when it came publicly in front of the cameras, not only did Trump not castigate Erdogan in any way, he basically spoke very warmly about him. He's a good guy. We can trust him. He's very clever. He took over Syria. What a great thing he did. Again, he did suggest that Americans could mediate, and he said in so many words, in very Trumpian language, that if anything, the Israelis had to be reasonable about this, which was certainly not music to Netanyahu's ears. The latest on that issue between Turkey and Israel is there are the beginning of talks. This was confirmed by the Turkish foreign minister to create some sort of deconfliction line, because obviously Turkey sits between Israel. Syria sits between Turkey and Israel. Israel's basic aims in Turkey today are to make sure that a lot of the hardware of the Assad regime does not fall into the hands of the new government, and to make sure that there are no forces that enter Syria that can be a risk for the future. And there is a major worry about Turkey in the future. There are some former security officials who have even gone as far as to say Turkey represents an even possibly bigger threat to Israel than Iran. So it is something very worrying for Israel. And it's clear that Netanyahu did not get what he wanted on that issue either. What we do know is that this meeting did not go as planned. Netanyahu did not walk away from any achievements. If anything, he got himself a certain amount of warnings on Iran, on Turkey, and at the moment the tariffs are staying. As opposed to last time, we didn't get all these congratulatory messages on social media and all these talking heads for Netanyahu and the Likud talking about what a great meeting, talking about the great chemistry between Trump and Netanyahu, how he's on board with everything that Israel wants to do. The fact that we didn't hear any of this just goes to show how very few people took this meeting in a particularly positive way. As far as the possible negotiations with Hamas go, there are very low-level negotiations. Egypt came up with a proposal, some sort of compromise between Israel and Hamas. At the moment, that's all it is. Israel claimed that it didn't receive the offer and then accepted that it did, but then basically said it's a non-starter because, once again, even when there is flexibility on many of the issues, how many hostages to be released, how many days of ceasefire, humanitarian aid, etc., Hamas still demand that part of the ceasefire would be to negotiate towards an end of the war, which would mean, in Hamas's eyes, that Israel would leave the Gaza Strip, Hamas would return to power, and that is considered unacceptable to Israel. Israel is going further and further into Gaza. It is creating more and more buffer zones. At the moment, there is little to no fighting. There have been some rockets launched at Israel from Hamas, from Gaza this week. But at the moment, the IDF isn't really fighting too much. It is taking over more territory, but it seems that Hamas as a fighting force has decided to stay underground largely, hoping to wait Israel out. Israel is in a bit of a quandary. It wants to, especially the chief of staff, wants to take a far more robust approach, wants to really bring in tens of thousands or more forces into Gaza and really sort of take on Hamas from different parts of the Strip at once. At the moment, we haven't seen that massive call up of reserves that would be necessary for such moves. But it could just be a matter of time. I'm sure this was something that was discussed in the White House as well, but at the moment we don't see any signs of anything more than just holding more and more territory. As I said, the negotiations don't seem to be going anywhere. Hamas understand that this is probably the last time they'll get to negotiate if they do release more and more hostages. So for them, they really have to stand their ground, but Israel also is standing its ground. On Lebanon, there's now more and more talk about disarmament as opposed to just keeping Lebanon away from the border. There are more, more and more voices who are calling for disarmament. There was the American mediator, Ortegas, who came to the region this week, and certainly the buzzwords at the moment are disarmament. It is something even an anonymous Hezbollah official was quoted as saying that we are ready for a certain amount of disarmament. If that's true, then it really does show what a bad state Hezbollah are in. Israel did get some intel this week that Hezbollah have been using the ceasefire to try and develop more and more weapons. They have Israel found a weapons factory in the Dahia, which is the Hezbollah stronghold just outside the capital Beirut, and it's certainly taking steps to try and push Hezbollah back even more. It would be interesting to see if there can be an agreement. On the one side, Hezbollah disarms. On the other side, Israel removes itself from the 5 points along the border. Finally, a little bit of internal domestic politics. As we know, the Knesset is on a break, and it will be for a few weeks because of the Passover holiday, which begins on Sunday. But there's no real let up on pressure on Netanyahu, especially from the ultra-Orthodox. We haven't heard too much over the last few months from the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party, Shas, and its leader, Aryeh Deri. That relative silence was broken, where Aryeh Deri basically said if there is no agreement on the idea of enlistment law, in other words, the non-enlistment of the ultra-Orthodox public, by the start of the summer session, then they will not feel themselves bound by coalition discipline. And in fact, they believe that they could vote against, or at least not vote for. Now, that is an annoyance to Netanyahu, especially if he has a legislative agenda coming up, but it's not a threat to the government. Deri doesn't say he'll leave the government, doesn't say he'll vote against, certainly not a vote of no confidence. So it's pressure. Deri, because he pretty much took a back seat to Goldknopf and others over the last few weeks, probably feels the pressure from some in his community. This was probably a way to say, look, we're acting as well. We're acting with a certain amount of balance and moderation. But for us, it is still an issue, and we still have to act according to our interest. As I said, it won't bother Netanyahu too much because there's no real threat to his coalition. The budget has been passed. It would only be a vote of no confidence, which means that some in his coalition would have to cross the aisle and vote in favor of a vote of no confidence, which is not a threat. No one is saying that. So Netanyahu's tenure is not really in threat, but it could certainly spoil any particular plans that Netanyahu has legislatively in the upcoming session. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Ashley. I will begin with a question here from Rabbi Joel Schwartzman, who asks, Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot wrote a lengthy document about Israel's strategy. Obviously, on October 7th, Israel's military strategy failed for the southern communities. To your knowledge, who, if anyone, is working on a new military strategy for Israel today? What elements have changed and what may have been added?
That's a very wise question, with certainly a lot of elements. On a strategic level, yes, there's been many discussions since then. Obviously, they were led by previous IDF Chief of Staff Herzliya Levy, now by Eyal Zamir, who comes in with a very different approach, both because of his background as a tank commander and because he comes from a more, let's say, hawkish background. He likes to fight very much on the front foot. For many years, the Chief of Staff was largely defensive, and that's perhaps what led to October 7th, not leaving out the political level, which obviously plays a major role in this. But there are many discussions. The threats have changed. Hezbollah is not the threat that it was. Not to say it can't be again in the future, but at this point in time, Hezbollah are not the threat that it was. In Syria, it's certainly a better move. If Israel could have decided whether to have had Bashar al-Assad or to have the current rulers in Syria, probably would have plumped for that, just because Assad, was basically allowing his country to be a conduit between Hezbollah and Iran, and many other factors which were very problematic on the Iranian side. Hezbollah are in major trouble. They cannot bring in money. They're supposed to be paying rent for those people in the south of the country who were displaced. They're supposed to be paying for their hospitals and all their schools and everything else. And they simply can't bring the money in as easily as they could before. So that was a major blow, and that certainly got to be taken into it. As I said, the big worry for many on the northern or northeastern border of Israel is now Turkey. There is a concern that Turkey could become the de facto rulers, militarily at least, in Syria. And Turkey is a very technologically advanced army. Let's not forget Turkey is part of NATO, and that presents its own complications. So that's something certainly to be looked over. As far as Iran, there's been a lot of training going on for there. There is this feeling that there is a window of opportunity. I've talked about that quite a number of times in recent weeks and months. But it could be the political and diplomatic clock does not align necessarily to that. And with this announcement by President Trump that there will be direct negotiations or direct talks or whatever it is, certainly pushes everything back, because the Iranians know above anything else how to play for time. And there is a certain amount of concern that the American side will be led by Steve Witkoff, who, while he was credited with the first ceasefire and the release of hostages in the more recent deal, there is a feeling that he didn't get a lot of the other negotiations and messed up on some of the others. So the fact that he's leading the American side is of concern. That really, Israel cannot go it alone. And while there are negotiations and the prospect of some sort of negotiated deal, the Americans probably won't give a green light to Israel. And as I said, the Iranians are really expert in just pushing the clock further and further and further back. So basically, it's a moving target. Things are changing in this region so quickly. The Houthis are also not the force that they were even a few months ago because of the daily attacks from the Americans. They have tried to launch rockets, missiles, ballistic missiles at Israel. Some of them have not reached their targets. Some fell short in Saudi Arabia, but all of them that reached Israel or on their way to Israel were shot down. So they haven't really been able to do too much to target Israel during this time. The threats are not there. Also, even in the seas, which they've basically been bullying for a number of years now, they're not able to do as much. The American force there is hurting the Houthis. So it's very difficult to create some sort of strategic plan because the region is changing so quickly. And a lot depends on the diplomatic level, on the political level. Will Israel have enough time? Will they be given enough time domestically, internationally, to finish the job against Hamas? Will there be another hostage deal? Certainly, Israel wants to give it time to be a hostage deal. But it's clear that if that doesn't happen, and if Eyal Zamir is allowed to go through with his plans, it will certainly be a far more brutal assault on Gaza than we saw previously, quicker. There was a lot of criticism that Herzliya took too long, or the political level took too long, whatever it is. But now there's a feeling that you have a new sheriff in town, and he wants to do things very differently. So he'll have a very different plan. And of course, all of these things are constantly being looked at and, edited and reassessed all the time. But it's clear that Israel needs to take a different approach since October 7th. It has to be more on the front foot, not just wait for things to happen, not just believe that certain things are taking place just because they want to believe it, as the government and the security forces in Israel believed pre-October 7th. So yes, that's a very long-winded way of saying that there are strategic plans. They are constantly being reassessed, but it's clear things have changed to a certain extent. Unfortunately, we've always also got to remember that as much as there were resignations at the highest level of some of the security agencies, 90% of the system remains in place, and that was the same system. that simply missed everything leading up to October 7th.
All right. Thank you very much. Now, there was a report in the Jerusalem Post from earlier today where it notes that about 75% of Hamas's tunnels in Gaza are still intact, including a significant number of those used to smuggle goods between Egypt and Gaza. Now, you mentioned that while Israel is occupying parts of the Gaza, there hasn't been a lot of fighting. In the attempts to get rid of these tunnels, how does that affect the goal of keeping these hostages alive while doing that?
Right, well, that's an important point. We know that all of the hostages are being held in these tunnels. So Israel is very circumspect because a lot of these tunnels are interlinked. So even if you take out a tunnel, not necessarily that is in the immediate vicinity of the hostages themselves, it could affect them physically. So Israel's being very careful, but largely it's just a matter of time and opportunity. It's very hard. It's not so easy like blowing up a house or something like that, to blow up a tunnel. Even if you blow up a certain section, that can relatively be easily rebuilt. Let's not forget, the figures at the beginning of the war. Everyone was saying that the amount of tunnel is larger than the London Underground system, which goes across the whole metropolitan area of one of the largest cities in the Western world. So we're talking about a massive system, and it's very hard to get to all of that. 25% is not a small number. It sounds, in percentage terms, it's a small number, but in actual terms, it's a very large number. There were many figures who said that it would take, if not many, many months, certainly years, to completely demolish the whole system. And yeah, it seems that it is taking a long time. And when you factor into the hostages into that, it's not amazingly surprising that the number is as small as that. Again, I think without the hostage issue, they would be able to do a lot more. But again, because of time, because of everything else, and don't forget, that's manpower as well, and that's manpower taken away from other military actions. So it's unsurprising. It's not. It's around that number, and just to demolish it possibly could take the years that some commentators suggested.
All right, thank you. Now, Stephen Miller would like to ask, you mentioned that President Trump gave Netanyahu a warning on Iran. Do we know exactly what that was?
As I said, there wasn't a specific warning. What it was basically, we're trying to negotiate. That is where we are at the moment, which clearly is not where Netanyahu wants the American administration to be, which is putting maximum pressure, and with not just a threat, a theoretical threat, but a timetable, an actual timetable. Because as we know, these kind of military actions, if there is ever going to be a military action, takes time to arrange, to practice, to look into all the intelligence, to figure out exactly what needs to be done. It's not something, even if there was a green light tomorrow, it could take weeks, if not months, for all the different elements to be in place. And every day of negotiations that turns into a week of negotiations that turned into a month. We saw in the lead up, I don't know if many people remember, but to get to the final signing of the JCPOA took years. The Iranians knew very well how to put everything off. And a lot of the administration, the current US administration, has no real experience in negotiating with Iran. And they really are arguably some of the best negotiators in the world. There is that sort of stereotype of the Persian bazaar, but to some extent it's true. The Iranians have thousands of years of expertise in negotiating, and they do it very, very well. So there's certainly a certain amount of pessimism in Israel about this. So it wasn't necessarily a warning from President Trump, but it was, at this point in time, diplomacy is taking precedence, and we're going to give it a chance. And that's where we are at the moment. And that's certainly not what Netanyahu would have wanted to hear.
All right, thank you very much. I think we have maybe time for one more here. Now, the Trump administration and Steve Witkoff have been pretty lax when it comes to the issue of Qatar. Now, if the allegations that are being investigated in the Qatargate scandal actually are proven and come to light, do you think that this might change the Trump administration's tune and force them to be a little tougher on Qatar?
I don't think it's really related. I mean, first of all, we know that some of the allegations are true because everyone's admitted it. That at least Feldstein, one of the former close advisors to Netanyahu, was accepting money through a third party from Qatar. Now the question is, who else was? The allegations are that even closer advisors to Netanyahu were accepting money and acting for Qatar when they were pretending to act on behalf of the Prime Minister's office. That's one of the harshest allegations, that they basically gave the press communiques, talking points, etc., when the media professionals thought that they were getting that from the Prime Minister's office, when in fact it was going through Qatar. I don't think that will necessarily have a bearing on what's going on in the US. The US has its own issues. There are quite a number of people in and around the administration who also have a history with Qatar one way or another. Let's not forget it's got the largest base in the region, and Qatar know very, very well how to play that. So we don't see any pressure on Qatar at this moment from the US administration, and also from the Israeli administration. We heard Netanyahu come out during the sort of height of Qatargate, I think it was last week, basically calling Qatar a complex country, denying that it was seen as an enemy country and calling it complex, which is certainly not what one would expect to say of a country which harbors, hosts, funds, and supports a terrorist organization which seeks the destruction of your state and was behind October 7th massacre. So it's clear that it is a major issue on both sides. At the moment, Netanyahu is happy for that to be off the headlines for the moment. But certainly we haven't heard the last of it. But I'm not sure that there is too much of a connection between what's going on in Israel and what that could mean for America's relationship with Qatar moving forward.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. We have reached the end of our podcast for the week. I want to thank you again for taking the time to give us an update this week.
Thank you.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout in your email inboxes for our weekly podcast offerings email for the following week. As always, I thank you all again for your participation and for your viewership, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.